Well, good evening. It is very good to see all of you here for the Bible study. And we're getting into the book of Exodus this evening. Now, a couple of the handouts that I've handed you, I'd like to make a little comment upon. One is a map, and we will refer back to that a little later. But what we have is this is the area of Egypt where Israel was, and shows the pathway of the Exodus and the crossing into the Sinai, coming down to Mount Sinai or Horeb. Now, you can notice various paths of the Exodus if you look at different maps in your Bible. Different ones will show it, and often you look at the path, and it's pretty obvious that a lot of the map makers clearly missed the pathway, because in some cases, if you look at the Bible or you look at the maps in the back of your Bible and you see the pathway they've drawn, and it's like they came all the way across on dry land. Well, that's not what the book says. They've got them wading across some little mud puddle or some little tiny stream, and the scripture is very clear. They came across this area here of the Red Sea. It was deep enough that it drowned Pharaoh's horsemen, drowned Pharaoh's whole army. We're not looking at something that was just a few feet deep. We're looking at something that involved a great miracle to part the waters. And this huge number of Israelites came over. They didn't wade the puddle. So clearly they had to have come across, and the Bible makes plain that they were blocked in by the mountains and by the army coming in from the other direction. Now, if you notice this area up, the Mediterranean Sea is what is at the top, and you notice the Nile River coming up. The Nile, interestingly, is unusual in that it flows from south to north. And so when you read about Lower Egypt, you're talking about the part right up here in the north at the top near the Red Sea, or near the Mediterranean Sea. Upper Egypt is the part that's down in the bottom, which is backward from the way we normally think of it. But the reason they viewed it that way, Lower and Upper Egypt, had to do with the flow of the Nile. The Nile originated in the mountains down in Ethiopia and flowed downward in terms of elevation until it reached here and flowed into the Mediterranean. So in Egypt, when they spoke of directions, they spoke in terms of the Nile, the upper Nile being the part that was of higher elevation coming down from the mountains and the foothills, and then the lower Nile, or the lower Egypt, being where the Nile flowed out. Now, we use the term frequently refer to the delta, river deltas. That term had its origin with the Nile River here. In fact, if you look where the Nile comes up and then it branches into tributaries, and if you look at that, it is sort of a triangle that it makes as it comes up and goes out into tributaries. Well, the Greek the Greek geographers were the ones that gave this name delta. Delta is the fourth letter of the Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. And the delta in the Greek alphabet looks like a triangle. And so that was what this looked like to them, and that's what they called it. They referred to it as a delta. And that term has come to be used to refer to, regardless of how it looks, refers to any area there where the area along the river, where the river overflows and deposits the rich silt. The rich topsoil was brought from the upper Nile and was when the flooding occurred, this rich topsoil spread out, and really the habitable area of Egypt was within just a few miles on each side of the Nile River. And that's the way it is to this day. Most of Egypt is desert, and you've got an area that is well watered there along the Nile. They irrigated from the Nile, got very little, and much of Egypt got no rain whatsoever. It was a rare thing for rain in Egypt. The water came from the Nile. The Egyptians referred to their land as the gift of the Nile. Well, as you see here, and you can see where we'll come back and comment on this a little later in terms of the Exodus. Now, let's look at the chronology of Israel and Egypt. What you will find is that on the left-hand side of the sheet, biblical events are lined out, beginning with the call of Abraham, coming on down to the time when Joseph was sold into slavery, when he became a ruler in Egypt, the 7 years of famine, the entrance of his family, his death, or the death of Jacob rather than Joseph's death, birth of Moses, right on down to the date of the Exodus and the entrance of Israel into Canaan. Now that comes down, biblical dates on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have the corresponding account of Egyptian history and the various Egyptian dynasties. Many of these dynasties were contemporary. It was later historians that numbered them in the way that they did. So this is laid out down at the very bottom. Dynasty 18 of Thebes. I go through and list the individual rulers. This was the dynasty of the oppression. This was the dynasty in which Moses became a prince. Now, what you will notice is that the rulers of Egypt at an earlier time, the Hyksos, as you notice, the Hyksos dynasty ceased in 1567 and were replaced by Dynasty 18 of Thebes. The Hyksos are also known in history as the shepherd kings. One of the things we're told about them is that they were not native Egyptian. They were called Asiatics. They were people whose origin was over in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. They were a very similar people to Israel in terms of that basic stock of people. Now these shepherd kings had actually come into Egypt. They had invaded up here in the Delta area, and this was the dynasty in which Joseph rose to power, and it was actually, when you put the whole story from the Bible together, it is apparent that the years of famine and the years of plenty played a role in giving them the level of power and control over the entire land of Egypt. These shepherd kings, this is where Joseph rose to power. You know, when Joseph brought his father in, and we read it back in Genesis, when Jacob came down and Joseph was going to introduce him to Pharaoh, do you remember his statement? He said, "Now, Dad, when you see Pharaoh, make sure you emphasize to him that you are a shepherd, that you have kept sheep from your youth, because shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians." Well, now, first you look at that and you think, well, wait a minute. If shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians, why would you lay emphasis on the fact that you were a shepherd? Shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians, but the Hyksos were not Egyptian. They were the people that are known in history as the shepherd kings. This clearly identified Jacob and his family as having something in common with them and set them apart from the Egyptians. And so Pharaoh was after talking with them, was so favorably impressed, he said, "I'm going to give you land right up in the area of Goshen, right up here. That is good pasture land. In fact, I'd like for you to watch my sheep too. You can take care of, I'll hire you to supervise some of my sheep." So here was something that kept Israel physically, geographically separate from the area where the Egyptians were, because the Hyksos had pushed them out of that area, and it put Israel in that area there of the land of Goshen, where their flocks were the best pasture land, and they were. It was this dynasty, the Hyksos dynasty, that Joseph served, and it came to dominate this whole area. That's why we will read a little later that there arose a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. Because you see, the Hyksos dynasty was overthrown after Joseph's death, and a totally new dynasty came to power, and they had no connection with Joseph. They owed no loyalty to him for what he had done. They had no sense of obligation. He was, and so then they began to look upon the Israelites as potential enemies and someone that might aid their adversaries, and began the process of a systematic oppression, which evidently began by hiring many Israelites into construction, to building these treasure cities and building on this big building project that the Pharaohs got going. And as the Israelites, of course, left the land and were no longer self-sufficient because of they were working for wages for the Egyptians, then Pharaoh was in a position, you see, over a period of time to begin to increase the pressure on them, to lower the wages, to do various things, and to put them in a position where they were dependent upon him. And we find that 1567 is when Dynasty 18 of Thebes took place, and 1523 is the birth of Moses. That means 44 years went by from the coming to power of Dynasty 18 until the level of oppression you read in the early part of Exodus. 44 years is a long time. You go back 44 years ago, that would be 1954. An awful lot has happened if you look at what's happened in this land, just socially, culturally, in so many ways over the period since 1954. You realize that things can be totally turned upside down in that long period of time, and I think most of us here old enough to be able to remember back to that point, and we look at what has transpired and how drastically different our culture and our society is and everything. And so a lot can happen in a period of 40 years plus. And of course, the oppression picked up, and it had its ups and downs, you see, by the time that God actually delivered Israel from Egypt. The oppression had been in progress for over 120 years. So that means that the problem became increasingly serious. And ultimately God dealt with it. I think one thing that's sort of interesting to notice, we read of Moses, and it's interesting, he was adopted as a prince of Egypt and received his name. Notice what so many of the pharaohs at that time were named. You had Amos, who was the founder of the dynasty, and most of the rest of them were Tutmos. You had Mose and Mose and Mose, and so where do we find Mose of the Bible? Well, we find him right there. That was where he fit. That was his dynasty. If you notice on the list of kings, between Tutmos II and Tutmos III is Hatshepsut, who was queen, who was co-ruler. She had come to the throne with her. She was the most likely the princess whom the princess that adopted Moses, and she was the daughter of Tutmos II, or Tutmos I. She was the wife of Tutmos II, and she became then co-ruler with him and continued with his son and her stepson, Tutmos III. She continued as associated as joint ruler with Tutmos III, and it was this is the time. It was during his reign, right after Hatshepsut died, that Moses, right around the time of her death, that Moses had to flee Egypt. Once his stepmother was dead, the princess, he was viewed as a rival. If you study, it's a puzzling thing until you begin to put it together, because when you look a little bit at Egyptian history, you realize human life was cheap in Egypt. The Egyptians didn't think anything about killing a slave. And so when you read the story of Moses, a prince of Egypt, who killed a slave, I mean, that's what the Israelites were, and when he was involved in that situation. In one of them, two Israelites were fighting. Moses intervened, and one was killed. Or even killing an Egyptian, killing an Egyptian taskmaster. Moses was a prince. His word was law. Well, what we find, of course, is a situation once Hatshepsut was dead, and Thutmose III wanted to eliminate any rivals. He was looking for a pretext. He was after Moses, and Moses realized that once he had intervened, stopped this beating, and killed the man who was beating the Israelite, that he knew that he was in trouble and he had to flee. Now, the story we pick up here is an account of of Moses' life, and we pick it up as we come on to the arrival of Israel at Mount Sinai, and that's, of course, that leads us up to Exodus 18. Now, let's notice a couple of things as we start. If we notice in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 5, chapter 1 verse 1 starts with the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. And we're told in verse 5, all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. For Joseph was in Egypt already. Joseph died and his brethren and all that generation. Now, let me call your attention to something, because it serves as a good illustration of how people mistakenly assume that the Bible contradicts itself. Now, we're told right here, how many of Jacob's family came into Egypt? Well, here it says 70 souls, Exodus 1 verse 5. But if you go back to Genesis 46 verse 26, all the souls that came with Jacob into Egypt, which came out of his loins, besides Jacob's sons' wives, all the souls were 66. Now, if you go back to Acts chapter 1, or chapter 7 rather, Acts chapter 7, Stephen's sermon, and in verse 14, we're told that then God sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him, and all his kindred, 75 souls. Well, now, were there 66, or were there 70, or were there 75? Does the Bible contradict itself? Well, the answer is in noticing very carefully what is said. Notice we're in Exodus, so we'll notice Exodus 7:14. Joseph called his father and all his kindred, 75 souls. So this was his father and all the kindred. Now, if we go back to Exodus chapter 46, verses 26 and 27, all the souls that came with Jacob into Egypt, which came out of his loins, besides Jacob's sons' wives, all the souls were 66. And the sons of Joseph, which were born him in Egypt, were 2. All the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70, or 70. The account in Exodus chapter 1, verse 5, said that the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. Joseph was in Egypt already. Now, what we have, if you count, do you count the wives or not? Well, in Acts, it's Joseph's kindred, all of Joseph's kindred. Well, that would include the in-laws. It's very clear in the account in Exodus that it's not counting the in-laws, not counting the wives. It's simply counting those who came out of Jacob's loins. And the difference in the figure is that, you see, there were 66 of Jacob's descendants that came into Egypt, but there were 4 that were already there. Joseph was there, Joseph's 2 sons were there, and Simeon had been held there in jail. So that was 70 altogether that came out of Jacob's loins. And that's where you get the 70 or the 66, depending on whether you're counting the ones that came in or simply all of the ones that had come out of his loins. He had 70 descendants that at the time of the entrance into the land. Now, when it says 75 came in, well, you had 66 who came in plus 9 wives. Evidently, we know Judah's wife had died earlier. Out of the 12 sons, that means there were 9 wives who came in. Well, Judah's wife had died earlier. Joseph's wife was already in Egypt. That eliminates 2 out of the 12, and we don't know for sure, but evidently one of the others had died as well. There's some evidence that maybe it was Simeon's wife, based on the genealogy of the children when they were born. But that's where you can count at 70, 66, or 75. Now, I've taken a little time on this because it serves to illustrate something, not merely to explain that verse, but to realize that the so-called contradictions in the Bible, most of them are like that. People pick 2 different verses and they say the Bible contradicts itself. Well, it's a matter of perspective in terms of how the biblical writer was stating the subject. These verses didn't contradict; they simply were written from a different perspective. Whether you're describing the number of total descendants that Jacob had, the number of people in the caravan that came down into Egypt, or the number of descendants that the number of descendants that he had that came into Egypt, as apart from any of the in-laws. There are 3 different ways of counting, and that's what you will find. And if you read the verses carefully, when somebody comes up with something, well, the Bible contradicts itself. If they think that, it's because they haven't clearly studied what the Bible said, and they're jumping to conclusions, just like even some of the commentators will do on this little. As simple as this little matter is, it's surprising how many of the commentators get it balled up, and a lot of the modern commentators will assume that it's different authors, and it just sort of contradicts itself. Well, it doesn't. Now, as we come on through the story, here in Exodus chapter 1, we have just a summary of the situation. A king arising, a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, who had no sense of obligation or loyalty to Joseph, who viewed the Israelites as a problem and began a systematic oppression of dealing with them in a way that ultimately involved their being put to work building these treasure cities. Now, one of the things that we notice, verse 12, the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. We find that God blessed the Israelites in a remarkable way. Now, if you notice the chronology chart from the entrance into the land, this was in 1682, down until the Exodus in 1443. So we're looking from 1682 to 1443, we're looking at 240 years, approximately. In this period of 240 years, the population of Israel grew from 70 souls to upwards of, 600,000 men besides women and children. So clearly upwards of a couple of million. That is remarkable when you think about that, and yet when you stop and look at it a little bit, you had 240 years for that to take place. And we're told that God blessed the Israelites in a remarkable way. They multiplied and grew, and as we come on down, we're told that verse 20, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied, waxed very mighty, and the story comes on down, emphasizing that God blessed the Israelites and multiplied them. So we read here in Exodus chapter 1, the latter part, the Pharaoh had decided that maybe the solution was to have some of the baby boys killed. So he called for the midwives, and he was going to have them be responsible for that. This was going to be his solution, but the midwives didn't do that. They didn't involve themselves in what Pharaoh wanted done. So he called them, and he was upset that they hadn't followed his instructions. But notice what they told him in verse 19. They said, well, the Hebrew women aren't like the Israelite women. By the time we get there, the baby's already been born. Well, God obviously was blessing them in a remarkable way with just virtually no infant mortality, with easy births. There may have been, a number of twins born. We're not told that directly. You also figure it hasn't been that long ago that large families were common. Most of us go back to a couple of generations ago, and families of 10 or 12 or 15 were not uncommon. And if you had a situation like that, you just, as you begin to have growth on that sort of scale, it is amazing how quickly. Just let's use 10 because it's a round number. If you started out with let's say with 50, because we had the 70 that came in, we had the older generation that had already had children and their wives. So we're looking. Let's just use 50 because it's a round number. 10. If each of those, you began to produce large numbers of children, you can grow very quickly. If you have 51, if you have 50 families, and each of those families produces 10 new families, well, you've gone from 50 to 500 in one generation. 500 to 5,000, 5,000, from 50 to 500 to 5,000 to 50,000 to 500,000. 5 generations. Now if you wanted to figure 5 generations and give them 40 years in which to have this large family, you're only looking at 200 years having passed. We're looking at a period of 240 years that passed from the time Jacob came in until the family, until the Exodus. So what you find, of course, is that as your numbers go up, they began to, after the first 2 or 3 generations, then it really begins to grow. And if things had kept up, we had a family reunion back several years ago. My wife's grandmother's children and their grandchildren and so on. She's up in her late 90s and had a large family. If all of her children and all of their children had 10 children that she had, there would, instead of just 200 of us there would have been no telling how many. You began to figure it out that because in later generations, instead of large families, the tendency is more to 1 or 2 kids, then it doesn't tend to show up that way. But that's clearly God had directly blessed them in a remarkable way, and their health was good. And even as Pharaoh oppressed them, that should have, as things got harder, that should have decreased the population, or should have at least slowed the population increase. But we're told that the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. They weren't just adding, they were multiplying. So God's hand was on it. God intervened, and as I say, there may have been an unusual number of twins born. There are a lot of things even that would have multiplied it out. But what we know is that in a period of 240 years, the population of Israel went from 75 to upwards of a couple of million, and that's a very significant increase. Now, God prepared Moses for a job. God has jobs. God calls us, and He has a purpose. Moses was a remarkable individual. His story is told, and his being saved from death is told here in Exodus 2. Moses was raised as a prince of Egypt. Consider how God worked things out. Moses' sister, Miriam, who was several years older, was a very quick-thinking young girl. She was there to watch when she saw what happened, and the princess and her maids had discovered the little baby. She immediately just sort of popped up, and instead of saying, "That's my little brother," she said, "Here's the baby crying. What do you want to do when you've got a crying baby?" "You want to get him to stop." And the baby was hungry. That was pretty evident, and here he was crying, and they were what to do. And she said, "You want me to go get one of the Israelite women to come nurse him?" Boy, that's instant. That's idea is an instant success. So she went back and got her mother, and her mother came down there, and of course that quieted the baby down. That was what he wanted. So now Pharaoh's daughter is going to pay Moses' mother to take care of little Moses, and she most likely served as a nurse or a nanny or whatever you want to call it for years, because where did Moses, as he got on up older, where did Moses learn the truth? How did he learn about God? Well, he was being taken care of, there from the time he was in the nursery of Pharaoh's palace on up through adolescence, at whatever period that was cut off. He was taught and trained and instructed by his mother in things about God and the truth. He also, of course, was trained as he reached adolescence, would have been trained as a prince of Egypt, and would have learned all the skills that any prince of Egypt would have gained. Stephen tells us in Acts chapter 7 that Moses was a man mighty in words and deeds among the Egyptians. He was an individual of great accomplishment. Josephus, the Jewish historian, recounts battles and that Moses fought, and his conquest of Ethiopia and certain things. Moses had received a lot of training in the first 40 years of his life, and then he was faced with a crisis, and he had to flee. Moses wasn't ready to lead Israel out of Egypt at 40 years of age. Now, we would have maybe looked at it and said, well, he's in his prime. He's at a peak of strength and health and ability. He's gotten all this training as a prince of Egypt. He's, skilled as a leader, and he knows all these things. He ought to be ready to do it. God said no. Because you see, God wanted something else learned. It's interesting, the model that is used through Scripture for leadership is that of a shepherd. Christ describes himself as the good shepherd. Peter talks about when the chief shepherd shall appear. Moses was trained as a shepherd now for 40 years. He got all sorts of training in learning to handle sheep. And in the course of that, somewhere along the line, God made the point to him, the way I want you to handle people is what you learned out there working for your father-in-law when you were herding the sheep. That's the way I want you to deal with people. I want you to be a shepherd to my people, Israel. And that was totally different leadership skills than what princes of Egypt generally exercised. Shepherds were an abomination to them. They didn't want anything to do with that. You weren't going to learn to be a shepherd in Egypt. And again, you read a little bit about the cruelty that permeated Egyptian history and culture. You realize that was not the model that God wanted, the one he was going to use to lead Israel. So while there were undoubtedly things that Moses learned, there had to be some unlearning. Now Moses had taken up with Jethro the Midianite. Midianites were descendants of Abraham, and clearly a knowledge of the true God had been maintained and preserved to some extent here. We find later reference to this, that Jethro was not a pagan. God began to deal with Moses here as we read it in Exodus 3. Now Moses was not quick to volunteer to want to lead Israel out of Egypt. In fact, Moses was convinced that he wasn't the one. He offered various excuses. You know, God called him. God didn't want to hear excuses, but Moses had some. Exodus 3:11, Moses said unto God, Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? You know, I'm not the one. You need to find somebody else. Who am I that I should do this? Well, God said, I'll be with you. Well, it comes on down in verse 13. Moses said, well, when I come back there and tell them the God of your fathers has sent me, they're going to say, what's his name? And I'm not going to know what to say. I can't go back there. I don't even know your name. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. Thus shall you say unto the children of Israel, I am has sent me unto you. Well, we come on down a little bit further. And Moses said here in chapter 4, verse 1, Moses answered and said, they're not going to believe me. They're going to say, God hadn't appeared to you. We don't believe that. God said, well, what's in your hand? And he said, a rod. He said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from before it. Scared the daylights out of him. Boy, if you had a stick out here and somebody said throw it down, you threw it down, and all of a sudden it turns into a snake and it begins to writhe and hiss and come at you. Moses was ready to get out of there. He didn't know what he had hold of. Now here came the hard part. God told Moses, verse 4, put forth your hand and take it by the tail. Now you know Moses was really an obedient fellow, because he put forth his hand and caught it. And that probably took about as much faith as anything God called on Moses to do. And it became a rod in his hand. Here it was a rod. And so God dealt with him and he said, I will show Pharaoh and I will show Israel that I am with you and I'm backing you up. Well, we come on down. See, Moses still wasn't satisfied. And so verse 10, Moses said, Oh Lord, I'm not eloquent. I'm slow of speech, of a slow tongue. I just don't think I can do it. I'm not eloquent. He'd been away from Egypt 40 years. He probably was rusty in terms of the dialect. If you've been away speaking a different language, if it's been 40 years since you've had occasion to speak a language, you may feel a little bit inadequate. Maybe Moses was, he says, I'm slow of speech. I'll stumble over my words, and I think you need somebody else. You need somebody that's a better speaker. And God said, who made man's mouth? Who makes the dumb, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? What do you mean telling me that you can't speak? Who do you think made the mouth? Now he went on. God began to be stirred up, and he told Moses, he said, look, you got a brother, and I know he can speak. He doesn't have any speech impediment, and he's very fluent. So we'll let him do the speaking. You tell him what to say, I'll tell you, you tell him, and he'll tell Pharaoh. Well, that sort of wiped out the excuses. But, sometimes we can be a little like Moses. We start looking for excuses as to why we can't do what we're supposed to do. Well, I can't do this, and I can't do that. I sort of get the impression here that God does not really want to hear our list of excuses as to why we're unable to perform what he asks us to do. So Moses came on back. Now we come to an account that has puzzled various ones. Verse 24, it came to pass by the way in the end that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Now what in the world is that all about? Well, if you read the context, his wife Zipporah took a sharp stone and circumcised her son, threw it at Moses' feet, and said, "Surely a bloody husband are you to me." So he let him go. And she said, "A bloody husband you are," because of the circumcision. Now, if you go on and read the story, you find at this point Moses sent Mrs. Moses and little Moses back down to Jethro and said, "I'll see y'all in a few weeks. I'll see you in a few months when I come back." Because when Moses comes out, Jethro comes and the family is with him. See, Moses had started back into Egypt bringing his family. Now, God let him get right to the border, where he spent the night right at the border, just ready to enter into Egypt. And God had called Moses to go back to bring Israel out, to bring Israel into a covenant relationship with him. What was the sign of the covenant? Circumcision. What had Moses not done? He had not circumcised his children, his son. The implication is clearly that his wife hadn't wanted it done. She had objected. She, in fact, sort of threw a fit here at this point. Moses was the meekest man in all the earth. Evidently, Mrs. Moses was not the meekest woman. So he hadn't circumcised the children, or his son. And God sort of just waited to see what he was going to do. Well, he was going to go all the way back down to Egypt and just lead them out that way without having addressed the problem in his own family. Well, if you're going to tell others what to do, you'd better be practicing what you preach. Moses was going to go down there and say, "The God of our fathers has sent me, and here's the sign of the covenant, and only those who are circumcised can take the Passover." That was what we were told there in Exodus 12. That was for the circumcised, and only those who took the Passover would be spared. Well, here Moses was not addressing the problem in his own family, and so it got to the point that it became clear that he wasn't going to take the initiative and solve the problem. So God struck him down. And they evidently knew what the problem was, because his wife knew what needed to be done. By this time, Moses was so sick he couldn't do it. So now she had to do it. She evidently didn't do it in a real good attitude. As you see, she cut it off and then she cast it at his feet and she said, "Surely a bloody husband are you to me." So she did it, but she was not real happy about it. But nevertheless, it was done, which was undoubtedly intended to be as a lesson for her, as well as a lesson for Moses. And there are lessons on every level that we can learn as we go through the Scripture. I mean, you learn that, yes, this happened historically, but there are principles that we can learn. If you put off doing what you're supposed to do, if you put off obeying God in any area, sooner or later you're going to come to some point and push is going to come to shove. God is going to put you in a spot where you're going to be faced with making a decision, and it probably won't be as convenient and as easy as if you had done it when you knew you should have done it. Moses things would have been a little easier had he done it earlier. But there are lessons here. You see, as we study the history of events, we want to learn to identify and apply principles in our lives, because God teaches us in these ways. Well, he met Aaron. They came down, and now they began to go to Pharaoh, and they were told Pharaoh to let the people go. Pharaoh, of course, was not real responsive to that request. Pharaoh said. Pharaoh got upset, and you find that Pharaoh's response here in Exodus chapter 5 was given in verse 2. He said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I don't know the Lord." And God said, fine, let me introduce myself. But you're going to get to know me quite well over the course of the coming months. Pharaoh made a very foolish statement. Who is the Lord? Who is Yahweh? Who is the Eternal that I should obey him? I don't know him. I don't have to do what he says. Well, God began the process of persuasion. Now, it's interesting how the Israelites responded. You see, Moses went down there, and when God first began to intervene in their behalf, did you notice things got worse rather than better? Sometimes when you first begin to be called and God begins to work with you, it's like things get worse instead of better. These trials and difficulties come. Moses came down there, came to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, obviously, some of these folks have got too much time on their hands. Let's work them a little harder. Let them make bricks without straw. And keep the quota of bricks the same. They can, in their spare time, go out and gather the stubble. So what did the Israelites say? Well, they said they were really mad. Verse 21 of Exodus 5. They said, "The Lord look upon all your fault." That's what they said. And that's sometimes the case. Here was Moses doing God's will, and he got blamed for causing the problem. Moses wasn't causing the problem, but that was the way it seemed to them. So we come on through the story here in chapter 6. God began to send plagues, and here in chapter goes on into chapter 7 and chapter 8, talking about the various plagues. You see, God sent them. The first thing he did was change the river to blood. They considered the Nile the life giver. The Egypt was the gift of the Nile. The Nile was a symbol of life. So the first thing God did was turn it into blood. It became the symbol of death. And they were confronted with the fact that, see, God was executing judgment against the gods of Egypt. Everything they trusted was shown to be empty and futile. So he started with turning the rivers to blood, then the plague of frogs, lice, swarms, cattle died was the 5th plague. The boils came as the 6th plague, the plague of hail that devastated a lot of the crops. The locusts then came, and then the plague of darkness. And the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn. Now, the first 3 plagues affected everybody. But between the 3rd and the 4th plague, God severed the land of Goshen from the land of Egypt. I think there is a parallel there, that we should not be under the impression that though God will protect us, that we will escape every trouble that comes on this nation in the end time. There was a period of time before God made a distinction. Now, God intervenes for his people. I'll tell you, I was in San Antonio for the Bible study Sunday afternoon, and our deacon there in San Antonio, Conway Slaughter, in whose home we had the Bible study, lives right on the bank of the river. Now, you read about all the flooding they had down there? He's the only place along there that didn't flood. It was remarkable. They had predicted a certain crest, and that crest at that point simply didn't happen. And the water came right up to his house, but it didn't flood it. Really a remarkable thing. And you look around there and realize all the damage. Now, where did that water go at that point? Well, I don't know, but it didn't flood his home. And we didn't have any of the members there in the San Antonio or Austin area that were, people were inconvenienced and had certain problems and difficulties, but God watched over them. He protected his people. But we are not totally isolated from the things that happen, and I think that makes an interesting parallel. God began to, in Exodus 8:22, God says, "I will sever in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there. To the end that you may know that I am the eternal in the midst of the earth, I'll put a division between my people and your people. So the time is going to come when God will make that clear distinction. Now, as we come on down, the stage is set here for the final plague, the death of the firstborn. This is the culmination. Instructions are given in Exodus chapter 12 regarding the Passover. Now, the term Passover comes from what happened. The angel, the death angel, was to pass through the land and to pass over the homes that were under the blood of the Lamb. And that's where the term Passover comes. That's, of course, descriptive for us as we understand that we all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. The wages of sin is death. And yet, as a result of the sacrifice of the true Passover Lamb, Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God, who came to take away the sins of the world, because of that, because of his shed blood, we can be passed over, exempted from death. Now, they were told to observe the Passover. Verse 12 of Exodus 12, I'll pass through the land of Egypt this night, will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, man and beast, against all the gods of Egypt will I execute judgment. The blood shall be to you for a token. I'll pass over you. Verse 14, this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and you shall keep it a feast to the eternal throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. So the Passover was to be kept forever. It was a memorial. Now Christ said, when he observed the final Passover with his disciples, he said, this do in remembrance of me. This do as a memorial of me. This is something that is a reminder. A memorial is there to bring something to remembrance. Here was an occasion that occurred every year. And it was a memorial. It was a reminder. It was to bring to remembrance the what God did and how He saved their lives. Now, let's notice a little bit of what we're told here. God told them that this is to be, gave them the instructions on down verse 22, 23, in 24. Now God had also told them that they were to, in verse 22, you take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood, strike the lintel. Notice the end of verse 22. None of you shall go out at the door of his house until the morning. So we come on down, that verse 28, the children of Israel went away and did as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. They were told not to come out until morning, and we're told they did. Now, we find Israel, they were not to come out of their house until morning. Now, as we look at a couple of parallels, let's go back to Numbers chapter 33. 33, verse 3. They departed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the morrow after the Passover. The children of Israel went out with a high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians. Came out on the 15th, on the day after the Passover. Go back to Deuteronomy 15:1. Or 16:1, excuse me, Deuteronomy 16:1. Observe the month of Abib, and keep the Passover unto the eternal your God, for in the month of Abib the Lord brought you forth out of Egypt by night. Well, they came out by night, but they came out on the day after the Passover. They came out on the 15th. Well, on the evening of the Passover, they were told to stay in their houses until morning. And we're told that they actually followed the instructions. That was a rare occasion, so that was information was preserved. And I dare say they were scared enough after they heard all the wail and lament going up a little after midnight. They'd been told to stay in until morning, and that was one of the times that they weren't tempted to go out. They didn't want to find out what was going to happen. So the other thing is we just simply go back to Exodus 12, and you just look at the events that Pharaoh rose up in the night, and there was a great cry in Egypt. This is verse 30 of Exodus 12. He called for Moses and Aaron by night. Now, he didn't get on the telephone. He didn't buzz their beeper. He had to send a soldier. And he had to travel several miles. And so time elapses. And Moses and Aaron are summoned. And he called for them. So they had to turn around and go back to where he was. And then instructions were given. They had this interchange. They came back. Verse 33, the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them away in haste. The people took their dough. Verse 35, they did according to the word of Moses. They borrowed of the Egyptians jewels. They were given favor. We're told here that they went out by night. You see, it's a night, verse 42, to be much observed. It took them all day. You had 600,000 families to line up and to move them out. You don't do that in a few minutes. I mean, the plan had already been worked out, and organizationally things were lined out, but it took time to just simply get people together. They were collecting all these things from the Egyptians. When you put the whole story together, there's no way you can telescope everything into the events of the Passover, and try to put the Passover and night to be observed as though they were the same thing. You just run into problems. If you take the clearest scriptures to establish a point, Exodus 12 is clear. There are other places you can go in the Bible that are a little vague. Exodus 12 is clear, lays it out. If you go back to the New Testament, you see that Jesus Christ kept the Passover 24 hours earlier than the Pharisees did. Well, to me, that in itself is pretty simple. Who do you follow, Christ or the Pharisees? That's sort of, what do they call that, a no-brainer? The Pharisees did this and Christ did that. I wonder which one I should follow. Maybe God wants me to, the Pharisees, they're the ones for me to follow. Well, that's, notice here the timing in Exodus 12:40, the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. Now, if you look carefully, you'll notice the word was is in italics. The sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt, 430 years. Now, you could say it completed 430 years. It came to pass at the end of the 430 years, the self-same day, the host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. 430 years after what? Well, that's not really totally clear from Exodus 12:40, but there is a verse back in Galatians. You see, the Bible interprets the Bible. If we come back to the book of Galatians, chapter 3, we find our solution. Galatians 3, verse 16. Now to Abraham and to his seed were the promises made. And on down in verse 17. This I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul that it should make the promise of none effect. Now, Paul is here comparing the covenant made with Abraham with the covenant made at Sinai. And we're told there was a 430 years elapsed from the time God made the covenant with Abraham until he made the covenant at Sinai. Now, the covenant at Sinai was made just a matter of about 7 weeks after the Exodus. The Exodus occurred at Passover, and which is the middle of the first month. Exodus 18 makes plain that the Israelites came to Mount Sinai the beginning of the third month, which is the time of Pentecost, 7 weeks after the time of the Passover season. So the covenant at Sinai was made just a few weeks after the Exodus. Now, 430 years before, God had made a covenant with Abraham. Well, you read that in Genesis 17. God said to Abraham, "Walk before me and be you perfect." Abraham was 99 years old, and God appeared to him and said, "Walk before me and be you perfect. This is the covenant that I'll make. This is the sign of the covenant, circumcision." Well, Exodus 12:40 makes plain, when you use Galatians 3:16 and 17, Exodus 12:40 and 41 make it plain that from the time God made the covenant with Abraham, 430 years elapsed before he began the fulfillment of those things with Abraham's descendants. The sojourning of the children of Israel in Egypt completed 430 years. That would have been the better word to have added in. You see, that would have been the better verb to have supplied, because they didn't actually sojourn 430 years in Egypt. The 430 years completed was 430 years from the covenant with Abraham was completed at the Exodus. Evidently, God made the covenant with Abraham right at the time of what later became the first day of unleavened bread, the 15th day of the first month, because we're told it was the self same day. That's when God entered into that covenant with Abraham, the covenant of circumcision. And so now, 430 years later, so God begins to fulfill his promise to Abraham, but a long time went by. See, he told Abraham when he was 99, "You're going to have a son. I'm going to multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven." And at this point, Abraham had no sons. He said, "I'm going to change your name. We're going to call you father of a multitude." Now, you're 99 years old, and you don't have any kids, and you get to go out and make the announcement to everyone, "From now on, I'm going to be called father of a multitude." Well, he got off sort of a slow start. He managed to have one son, and then that one son had two sons, so we're on a roll, but one of those two didn't count, so now we're back to one again. See? Jacob. Then Jacob had 12 sons, so now we're making progress. We read of Jacob's family coming into Egypt, and now there's still only about 75 of them, counting the in-laws. But now, 430 years from the time God had spoken those words to Abraham, said, "I'm going to call you father of a multitude and give you the sign of circumcision." 430 years after that, here were 600,000 men besides women and children that were coming up out of Egypt on their way to the promised land. God did what he said, but he didn't do it on the time schedule that people would have had in mind. And that, of course, also tells us something. Well, God began to bring him out. And as we come on down through chapter 13, the account here of as God is bringing them out. Chapter 14, the events of the Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea. Chapter 15, a song of Moses that is given here. Now, in chapter 15, they've come to the waters of Marah, and we read here of the healing covenant that God established with Israel. He told them, verse 26 of Exodus 15, "If you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Eternal your God, and will do that which is right in his sight, will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I'll put none of these diseases upon you, which I've brought upon the Egyptians. For I am Yahweh Rophika. I am the Eternal that heals you." That phrase is actually two words in Hebrew. Yahweh Rophika, your God healer. Now, they came on through a little bit further, and they were complaining again, murmuring, and so we find here that God provided food. He provided quails, given here in chapter 16, and then we read of the manna. Now, the word manna simply means what's it? What's that? And that's that's what the Israelites said when they saw it. What's that? So that was the name of it, manna. Now, there are those who think that the Ten Commandments originated at Mount Sinai. Well, if they did, why was God expecting Israel to keep the Sabbath before they ever got to Mount Sinai and entered into the Old Covenant? Because in Exodus chapter 16, we find the Sabbath was in effect. God gave the manna, and He told them that the manna would come, and they would gather it fresh day by day. But on the Sabbath, there wouldn't be any manna. They were to gather a double portion on Friday. If they gathered a double portion any other day, it would breed worms and stink. But now, on the Sabbath, they were to gather the double, or on Friday, they were to gather the double portion. And sure enough, there were always a few hardheads. They weren't going to take God's word for it, or Moses, or anybody else. They went out to see for themselves. And so some of them, verse 27 of Exodus 16, went out to gather on the seventh day. And the Lord said unto Moses, how long refuse you to keep my commandments? How long refuse you to keep my commandments? So the people rested on the seventh day. So what we find is that God expected them to keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath was clearly demonstrated as to which day of the week it was. Manna was an unusual thing. We're told in verse 31 it was like coriander seed. It was white. Tasted sort of like wafers made with honey. And there are other descriptions of it as well, that there was a similarity to there was sort of the taste of oil or olive oil that it had. Other scriptures bring out, and it was back in the book of Psalms. It's called angels' food. Man did eat angels' food. So anyway, God miraculously fed the Israelites for this period of 40 years, and showing over and over that God was their provider. Chapter 18, Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses. And he, verse 2, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, and her two sons, Gershom and Eleazar. Now, this is where we find that at some point along the line, I think there at the time when Moses was ready to enter Egypt, he had evidently sent his wife and sons back. So now Jethro meets them, and they came there and camped at the Mount of God. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, told him all that God had done. Verse 9, Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had shown to Israel, and how he had delivered them out of the Egyptians. And we're told that in verse 12, Jethro took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron came and all the elders to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So Moses' father-in-law is not pictured here as an idolater. And I bring this out because there are those, one of the great hang-ups that some people have had in recent years, and hang-ups come and go. Some have had a great hang-up with the idea of any sort of governmental structure. And they say, government is pagan. That's Babylonian. Well, God has government in heaven. The head of Christ is God. We're told in 1 Corinthians 11. You got even government among the angels. You have archangels, which if you look that term up, it's the arche in the Greek. It's a term for prince. Here are rulers among the angels, various categories, and you read of varying beings there in heaven. So there's structure and organization in heaven. In the human family, God established structure. The head of the woman is the man, 1 Corinthians 11. Well, that sounds like structure. Head of the man is Christ. There's structure in the human family. There's going to be structure and government in the world tomorrow. Christ is going to be King of Kings. And some of us will rule over 5 cities and some over 10 cities. That's governmental structure. David will be king over all of Israel. And the 12 apostles will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes. If there's one thing you can count on about God, it's consistency. He's got government, and he's got a structured government in heaven. He designed for the family a structured government, and we're going to have one in the world to come. Why would the church be the only place where we'd do something totally different? That doesn't make sense. The idea, you see, some here in Exodus 18, there's some that would say, well, all this idea about government structure, that came from this old pagan Jethro. Well, that's not what it says. We find here Jethro worshiping the true God. And the next day, Moses was going to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from morning till evening. And Moses' father-in-law said, what are you doing? And Moses said, well, people have questions, and they come to inquire of God, and so I judge between them and explain the law. And Moses' father-in-law said, this isn't going to work. Verse 18, you're going to wear away, you and the people. This thing isn't going to last. You're going to wear out, and the people are going to wear out because they're going to be standing in line. So you teach them ordinances and provide men, verse 21, able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, place them as rulers over thousands and hundreds, 50s and 10s, and they'll judge the people, and then the great matters can be brought to you. Verse 23, if you shall do this, and God command you so, then you shall be able to endure, and all this people will go to their place in peace. And Moses hearkened and did what he said. God dealt with Moses face to face as a man with his friend. If God was displeased with Moses setting up this structure, he would have certainly told him about it. He told him about anything else that he wasn't pleased with. Frankly, just a little bit of common sense here goes a long way. How is Moses going to deal as one person with 600,000 families by himself? Well, that can't work. That's just wear everybody out. God used and worked through Jethro to encourage him to set up a structure. The problem, of course, is not structure, and the problem, of course, is how the structure is administered. If it's administered by godly men who walk in the fear of God, then it'll be properly done because they stand in awe of God. There are problems that exist in families. There are sometimes husbands or fathers that may be abusive, and these are horrible things. The problem is the structure in the family. The problem is that you've got an individual who doesn't fear God. And because he doesn't fear God, he abuses his authority. And that can happen. That can be anyone, man, woman, someone who's young, someone who's old. It doesn't matter if a person doesn't fear God and really stand in awe of him, then obviously he will abuse his responsibility. And that's the key that's given here. So we are up to the point of Mount Sinai. This provides a good break, and we will pick up the story and complete the book of Exodus next time. I think that brings us up to that point, so I'll pass out questions now and look forward to seeing you next time.